What actually triggers an avoidance fear of losing you? Triggering an avoidance fear of losing you requires understanding what makes them feel safe in the first place: your constant availability. When that safety net disappears through genuine behavioral shifts, their attachment system responds with anxiety they've been avoiding their entire lives. Today, you'll understand the psychological mechanisms that trigger an avoidance anxiety about losing you, and you'll get a practical, step-by-step approach to shift the entire dynamic. This isn't about playing games or manipulating someone into wanting you. This is about understanding a specific emotional pattern and knowing exactly what shifts that pattern from comfort to concern. Let's start with the basics, the way you'd explain it to someone who knows nothing about attachment theory or relationship psychology. Think of an avoidant person like someone who's learned that getting too close to a fire will burn them. They've been burned before, so they keep their distance. But here's the thing: they also enjoy the warmth of that fire. They want the benefits of closeness without the risk of getting hurt. So they've developed a strategy that works for them. Stay close enough to feel the warmth, but far enough away that they can't get burned. Your constant availability, your consistent presence, your emotional investment, these things become their warmth. They can pull away whenever they want because they know you'll still be there when they come back. There's no risk, there's no fear. There's just comfort in knowing they control the distance. The fear of losing you doesn't exist in their mind because loss isn't a real possibility to them. They've created an entire emotional system based on one core belief: people who love them will wait, will chase, will always be available. This belief didn't come from nowhere. It got reinforced every single time someone pursued them after they pulled away. Every time someone waited patiently for them to be ready. Every time someone accepted breadcrumbs of attention and stayed anyway. Their brain learned a pattern that works. And that pattern says distance is safe because connection is guaranteed. When you understand this at a basic level, you start to see why the usual relationship advice doesn't work with avoidance. Telling them how you feel doesn't trigger fear. It actually reinforces their comfort. Asking for more closeness doesn't create anxiety about losing you. It creates anxiety about too much intimacy, which makes them pull away even more. Expressing your needs doesn't make them value you more. It often makes them see you as demanding or needy, which justifies their distance. The psychological mechanism that triggers an avoidance fear of loss is deeply connected to something called loss aversion. This is a principle from behavioral psychology that shows people fear losing what they have more than they desire gaining something new. But here's the catch with avoidance: they have to actually believe they might lose something for that fear to activate. As long as your behavior signals that you're not going anywhere, their loss aversion stays completely dormant. They have nothing to fear losing because, in their mind, they haven't lost anything. You're still there. You're still available. You're still invested. Their attachment system, which is the part of their brain that manages emotional bonds and relationships, stays deactivated because there's no threat. Deactivation is their default mode. It's how they protect themselves from the vulnerability that comes with real emotional connection. When someone is deactivated, they genuinely don't think much about the relationship. They don't wonder about your feelings. They don't worry about losing you. They're comfortable in their independence, focused on other things, operating as if the relationship is a background element of their life, rather than a central one. But when something disrupts their sense of security, when the guaranteed warmth of that fire suddenly isn't guaranteed anymore, their attachment system starts to activate. Activation means their brain begins to register that something important might be slipping away. The comfort they took for granted starts to feel uncertain. The person who was always emotionally available starts to seem distant. The predictable pattern of pursuit and retreat gets interrupted by something they didn't expect: your genuine disengagement. This creates cognitive dissonance, which is when your brain holds two conflicting beliefs at the same time, and it causes psychological discomfort. The avoidant believed you would always be there, but your behavior now suggests you might not be. They believed they controlled the distance in the relationship. But now you're creating distance they didn't choose. They believed your emotional investment was permanent, but now it seems conditional. This discomfort, this dissonance, this unexpected shift, this is what begins to trigger their fear of loss. Now let's talk about the practical protocol for creating this shift, because understanding the psychology means nothing if you don't know what to actually do. The first behavioral change involves reducing your emotional availability gradually. This doesn't mean becoming cold or hostile. It means you stop being the person who always initiates deep conversations, checks in constantly, or provides emotional reassurance on demand. When they reach out, you respond, but with less emotional investment than before. Your tone stays friendly, but not eager. Your responses are genuine, but not elaborate. You're present, but not pursuing. This shift needs to feel natural, like you've simply redirected your emotional energy toward other parts of your life, because that's exactly what you should be doing. If you're performing disinterest while secretly obsessing over their reaction, they'll sense the inauthenticity, and nothing will change. The second change involves creating natural unavailability through genuine commitments and activities. This means filling your time with real interests, friendships, projects, and experiences that make you less accessible. When they want to connect, you're sometimes busy with your own life rather than immediately available. You're not ignoring them to prove a point. You're actually engaged in things that matter to you, things that would matter whether this person was in your life or not. This distinction is critical because avoidants have highly sensitive radar for manipulation. They've often used similar strategies themselves, so they recognize when someone is creating artificial scarcity to get a reaction. Real unavailability comes from a genuine life that fulfills you. Fake unavailability comes from a strategy to win someone back. The avoidant can feel the difference, even if they can't articulate it. The third behavioral shift means stopping the pattern of pursuing their attention or trying to draw them closer. This includes ending the habit of asking about their feelings, initiating most of your interactions, or trying to create intimacy they haven't chosen. When silence exists between you, you let it exist without rushing to fill it. When they're distant, you don't reach out to close the gap. When they're disengaged, you don't perform emotional labor to bring them back. This doesn't mean you become passive or checked out. It means you stop doing the work that should be mutual. In healthy relationships, both people contribute to connection. In relationships with avoidance, one person often does most of the connecting, while the avoidant does most of the distancing. When you stop over-functioning in your role, the imbalance becomes obvious. The avoidant might not notice immediately, but their subconscious registers that something fundamental has changed. The fourth element involves demonstrating independent contentment through your actual emotional state. This means your mood, your energy, your sense of well-being remains stable, whether they're engaged or distant. You're not happy to punish them with your independence. You're genuinely okay because you've stopped making their attention the source of your emotional stability. When they pull away, you don't chase or panic. When they're present, you don't cling or overflow with relief. Your emotional temperature stays consistent because it's no longer dependent on their proximity. This steadiness often unsettles avoidance more than any amount of emotional expression ever could, because it signals something they're not used to. someone who doesn't need them to feel complete. These changes must be genuine rather than performed. The shift should feel natural to you, not like a strategy you're executing. Your focus should be on actually building your own life, not on pretending to have one while secretly monitoring their reactions. This authenticity matters because the psychological impact only works when the avoidant perceives real change. If they sense you're running a tactic, their defenses go up, and they dismiss your behavior as manipulation. But when they perceive genuine disengagement, when they feel you pulling your emotional investment out of the relationship without explanation or drama, their attachment system responds with something they've been avoiding: anxiety about loss. The tension builds as these behavioral changes continue over time. Days turn into weeks. Weeks might turn into months. The avoidant notices things are different, but can't quite identify what changed. You haven't announced anything. You haven't had a big conversation about needs or boundaries. You've simply become less available, less emotionally invested, less focused on them. At first, they might feel relief. Many avoidants experience a sense of freedom when their partner stops pursuing closeness. They think this is what they wanted: more space, less pressure, less emotional demand. But as your disengagement continues and deepens, something shifts in their perception. The space they wanted starts to feel like abandonment. The freedom they craved starts to feel like rejection. The distance they created starts to feel like distance they can't control. This is where their fear response begins to activate in earnest. They start initiating contact more frequently, testing whether you're still emotionally accessible. They ask questions about your well-being or your emotional state, fishing for reassurance that you still care. They attempt to recreate previous closeness patterns, suggesting activities or conversations that used to draw you in. They show signs of anxiety about your reduced availability, maybe commenting on how busy you seem or how you've changed. They might seek reassurance about the relationship itself, asking vague questions about whether everything is okay or whether you're upset with them. These behaviors indicate their attachment system has activated. The fear of losing you has moved from abstract concept to present emotional reality. But several critical mistakes can destroy this entire process before it has a chance to work. Breaking the pattern too early happens when someone implements these changes for a few days or weeks, sees the avoidant reach out, and immediately returns to their previous behavior. This confirms to the avoidant that nothing has really changed and they can return to their comfortable distance. The person's availability was just temporarily reduced, not genuinely redirected. The avoidant's brief moment of anxiety gets soothed, and they go back to taking the relationship for granted. The pattern resets, often stronger than before, because the avoidant now has evidence that pursuing them still works. Explaining the shift creates another major problem. When someone tells the avoidant what they're doing or why they're doing it, the entire psychological impact disappears. The avoidant's fear response only activates when they genuinely perceive loss, not when someone announces they're trying to create that perception. Saying something like, "I need space to focus on myself," or "I'm pulling back because you haven't been present," turns an authentic behavioral change into a stated strategy. The avoidance brain immediately categorizes this as manipulation or as an ultimatum, both of which trigger their defensive patterns rather than their fear of loss. The power of this protocol lies entirely in its unspoken nature. Your behavior speaks. Your actions demonstrate. Your emotional state shows them something has fundamentally changed, and the lack of explanation makes it more real and more unsettling than any conversation could. Using the protocol as manipulation undermines everything because avoidance can sense inauthenticity even when they can't articulate it. If these changes aren't rooted in genuine self-development and honest reassessment of the relationship, the avoidant will feel the performance underneath your behavior. Their radar for manipulation is highly sensitive because they've often used similar strategies themselves. They know what it looks like to create distance strategically. They recognize when someone is pulling away to get a reaction rather than pulling away because they've genuinely redirected their emotional energy. When they sense manipulation, they don't respond with fear of loss. They respond with justification for their distance. Your behavior confirms their belief that people use emotions as weapons, which reinforces their avoidance rather than challenging it. Maintaining hope for reconciliation while implementing changes creates internal conflict that shows in your behavior. You might pull back physically while remaining emotionally fixated. You might reduce contact while obsessively analyzing their responses. You might build your own life while secretly doing it all to win them back. This divided energy gets communicated through subtle inconsistencies in your behavior. Your words say one thing, but your energy says another. The most powerful implementation of this protocol comes from genuinely accepting that the relationship might end and being okay with that outcome. When you've truly made peace with either possibility, them realizing your value and changing, or you moving forward without them, your behavior carries a different weight. There's no neediness underneath your independence. There's no hidden agenda underneath your disengagement. There's just authentic redirection of your emotional investment away from someone who hasn't been reciprocating it. The climax of this entire dynamic comes when the avoidant fully recognizes what's happening and what they stand to lose. This recognition doesn't always come in a single moment. It builds gradually as they watch you become increasingly content without them, increasingly engaged in your own life, increasingly indifferent to their patterns of pursuit and retreat. They see you laughing with friends. They notice you're genuinely busy when they reach out. They observe that your emotional state doesn't shift based on their attention anymore. They realize you're not waiting, not hoping, not organizing your life around the possibility of their presence. This realization creates a crisis in their attachment system because it challenges their core operating belief that they can maintain distance while keeping you close, that they can pull away while knowing you'll stay, that they can avoid intimacy while still having access to connection when they want it. Some avoidants respond to this crisis by finally stepping forward. They start pursuing the relationship with effort they never showed before. They communicate more openly about their feelings. They show up consistently in ways they hadn't previously. They demonstrate through actions that they recognize your value and don't want to lose you. This response happens when the avoidant has enough self-awareness and emotional capacity to recognize their patterns and choose differently. They see their fear of loss as information about what matters to them, and they use that information to motivate change. They might not transform completely overnight. Old patterns don't disappear just because someone gets scared, but their fear of losing you becomes a catalyst for examining their avoidance and doing the internal work necessary to show up differently in the relationship. Other avoidants respond to this crisis by increasing their distance even further. The anxiety of potential loss feels more threatening than the loneliness of being alone. They retreat into self-sufficiency, convincing themselves they never needed the connection anyway. They might deactivate so completely that they seem almost indifferent to your absence. They rationalize their avoidance with narratives about incompatibility or about relationships being too much work. This response indicates the avoidant's fear of intimacy is stronger than their fear of loss. No behavioral change on your part can overcome someone's deep-seated terror of vulnerability. When an avoidant chooses further distance in response to your genuine disengagement, they're showing you exactly how they handle emotional discomfort. By running from it, rather than moving through it. The resolution of this dynamic brings clarity regardless of which direction the avoidant chooses. If they step forward with genuine effort and sustained change, you get to decide whether their new behavior meets your needs and whether you trust that it's sustainable. You've created the conditions for them to see what they might lose, but you haven't forced them to change. They chose to show up differently because their fear of losing you outweighed their fear of intimacy. This distinction matters because change motivated by fear of loss can be real, but it needs to be followed by consistent action over time. The avoidant needs to demonstrate through weeks and months of different behavior that they've actually shifted their pattern, not just temporarily adjusted to keep you around. If they choose further distance or fail to respond with sustained effort, you also get clarity. You learn that your reduced availability didn't trigger enough fear of loss to motivate change, which tells you their attachment to their avoidance is stronger than their attachment to you. This information is painful, but valuable. It confirms that no amount of perfect behavior on your part could have created a different outcome. Their unwillingness or inability to show up differently isn't about your worth or your value. It's about their relationship to intimacy itself. When you've genuinely pulled back, built your own life, and found contentment independent of their attention, their lack of response becomes less devastating because you've already started the process of moving forward. This protocol works because it reflects genuine emotional health and self-respect. When you stop over-functioning in a relationship, reduce your emotional availability to someone who doesn't reciprocate, and build a life that fulfills you independently. You're not playing games, you're practicing emotional maturity. You're recognizing that your emotional energy is valuable and finite, and you're choosing to invest it in places where it's valued and reciprocated. You're acknowledging that constantly pursuing someone who pulls away creates an unhealthy dynamic that doesn't serve either person. You're accepting that love alone isn't enough to sustain a relationship when one person consistently avoids the vulnerability that intimacy requires. The avoidance fear response, when it comes, reveals something important about their attachment system. They often need the threat of loss to recognize value, which indicates their relationship to connection itself is conditional and anxiety-based. They don't value what feels secure. They dismiss what seems guaranteed. They only engage fully when they fear something slipping away. Understanding this helps you make informed decisions about whether this dynamic serves your long-term emotional well-being. A relationship where someone only shows up when they're afraid of losing you is a relationship built on their anxiety rather than their genuine desire for connection. That foundation might bring them closer temporarily, but it doesn't create the sustained intimacy and security that healthy relationships require. Real transformation in an avoidant requires them to do significant internal work on their attachment patterns. Your behavioral changes might trigger their fear of loss and bring them closer temporarily, but lasting change depends on their willingness to address their core avoidance patterns. Many avoidants will chase when they fear loss, but return to their distancing behaviors once they feel secure again. They cycle between anxiety about losing you when you pull away and anxiety about too much intimacy when you're close. This cycle can repeat endlessly unless the avoidant commits to understanding why they avoid vulnerability and learning to tolerate the discomfort of sustained emotional connection. That work typically requires professional support, honest self-reflection, and consistent practice over extended periods of time. The most authentic use of this protocol is not as a strategy to win someone back, but as a genuine reclamation of your own emotional energy and life focus. Whether the avoidant responds or not becomes less important than the fact that you've stopped sacrificing your own needs for someone who consistently pulls away. You've redirected attention toward building a life that fulfills you. You've stopped making another person's availability the center of your emotional universe. You've practiced setting boundaries not through words, but through actions. You've learned that your worth doesn't depend on someone else's ability to recognize it. These lessons and changes remain valuable regardless of what the avoidant does in response. This behavioral shift makes sense when someone has generally been present and engaged, but recently pulled away due to temporary stress or external circumstances. In these situations, giving them space while maintaining your own emotional health creates room for them to process and return naturally. The temporary distance allows them to manage whatever they're dealing with without the added pressure of meeting someone else's emotional needs. Your reduced pursuit removes the anxiety they might feel about disappointing you or not being enough during a difficult period. When they work through their temporary challenges and return to find you've been living your life fully, they often appreciate the space you gave them and engage more deeply because they didn't feel controlled or pressured. The approach becomes problematic when it's used to hold on to a relationship where someone has clearly communicated disinterest or consistently demonstrated they don't want the connection. At that point, these changes should be about your own healing and moving forward, not about triggering their fear of loss. Using this protocol as a last-ditch effort to make someone want you keeps you emotionally tethered to an outcome you can't control. It turns genuine self-development into strategy. It makes your well-being contingent on their response. When someone has explicitly ended the relationship or repeatedly shown through their actions that they don't want to continue, respecting that reality serves you better than trying to manipulate their emotions through behavioral changes. Recognizing the difference requires honest assessment of patterns over time. If someone repeatedly pulls away, comes back when you distance yourself, then pulls away again once they feel secure, you're dealing with a chronic pattern that your behavior alone cannot fix. This cycle indicates their avoidance runs deep enough that it requires professional intervention and personal commitment to change. Your continued participation in the cycle, even with better boundaries and more self-focus, enables the pattern to continue. Each time they return, and you accept them back without requiring evidence of sustained change, you reinforce their belief that they can avoid intimacy and still maintain connection. Breaking this cycle might mean accepting that the relationship can't continue unless they do significant internal work, and being willing to follow through on that boundary even when they show temporary signs of change. Your own emotional well-being should be the primary consideration throughout this entire process. If maintaining the relationship requires constant monitoring of your availability, careful management of your emotional expression, and ongoing anxiety about their response patterns, the relationship itself may not be serving your needs regardless of whether this protocol works. Healthy relationships don't require you to strategically withdraw to be valued. They don't demand that you become less available to earn someone's attention. They don't make you question whether your natural warmth and investment will push someone away. When you find yourself contorting your authentic self to manage someone else's fear of intimacy, you've moved away from genuine connection and toward emotional chess. That dynamic damages your sense of self over time, even when you're making the moves from a place of strength rather than desperation. Triggering an avoidance fear of loss is less about strategic manipulation and more about genuine self-respect and emotional health. When you stop overfunctioning, reduce your availability to someone who doesn't reciprocate, and genuinely invest in your own life, you create the conditions where an avoidant might recognize what they're losing. Whether they respond with renewed effort or continued distance, you've already won by reclaiming your emotional energy and self-worth. The protocol works because it's fundamentally about choosing yourself, setting boundaries through action rather than words, and building a life that fulfills you regardless of whether someone else shows up for it. That choice and that life remain yours, whether the avoidant returns or not. Share in the comments what behavioral shift has been hardest for you to implement in your relationships. I'd love to hear about your experiences with creating healthy boundaries and what you've learned about your own patterns in the process. If this video helped clarify the psychology behind avoidant attachment and gave you practical tools for shifting unhealthy dynamics, please like and subscribe for more content on relationships, attachment styles, and emotional health. Thanks for watching.